Bride Kidnapping by Tiana Saragusa. Bride kidnapping is a controversial practice that involves a man either consensually or non-consensually kidnapping a woman with the intention to marry her. Although this practice may be unfamiliar due to its lack of existence in the Western world, it's a well-known practice among a small country called Kyrgyzstan. The country itself is in the northeastern hemisphere, located between Kazakhstan and China. It was once a part of the Soviet Union before gaining its independence in 1991 after the Soviet Union fell. The country adopted Islam as its national religion and incorporated the traditions and customs within an epic poem known as the Epic of Manas as a way of living. Like most countries, the people are governed by similar human rights and civil laws, but there is one practice in particular that has overridden these government policies: bride kidnapping. The practice of bride kidnapping has integrated itself into the Kyrgyzstan culture through years of generational repetition. It is most commonly seen in rural villages due to the lack of government surveillance, but can also be found in the inner cities. For many families are supported or personal victims of this practice, but all claim that it relates back to an old tradition within the Kyrgyzstan culture. One of the locals even stated, "This is a tradition and you just can't change it." The act is performed by a man who has selected a woman he would like to marry. This chosen woman's relations with this man may vary from being acquaintances to family friends. Typically, the women targeted are under the age of 25 since they are yet to have relations with men and are at the prime age of beauty, purity, and personal independence. These factors are what men will use to determine their potential bride. Once a girl is selected, the groom will often rally a group of close friends to assist him in the act. Sometimes he will even ask the family of the woman or the woman's friends to help in the setup. Once the men have gathered a group together, they will briefly plan out the event and usually get intoxicated to calm their own nerves. They will then go to the location they are expected the woman to be at and kidnap her through the use of group force and resistance. The women are usually caught off guard by the attack and try to resist the men through both physical and emotional combat, such as crying and pleading. But due to the group force of the men overpowering the woman, they are successful in taking her to the family home where the groom's relatives prepare for her arrival. The duties of the man are complete once he has reached the home because the women of his family will take over by trying to convince the bride that she should marry the man. They will proceed to place a bridal headscarf on the woman as a symbolic meaning that she is accepting this offer and is willing to be married off. The act of trying to convince the woman can be very time-consuming because oftentimes the women may resist for hours and even days. Eventually, the women give in to the family's request and end up following through with their marriage and ceremony. The groom's family will prepare a celebration feast for the group and couple, and usually it's a Muslim ceremony held by a moldo, which is a Muslim cleric who will read the wedding rites. These ceremonies are usually not official, so it's up to the moldo to claim that voluntary consent was given on behalf of the bride. To assure that the moldo confirms the marriage as legitimate, the groom's family may propose monetary bribes. Only on rare occasions will the marriage be reported as a kidnapping and legal action is taken on the groom. This practice has proven to take a physical and psychological toll on the women. The act of physically being taken can be seen as humiliating and shameful. Even the ones that were consensually kidnapped can be emotionally scarred by the embarrassment and pressure they are placed under. Most will later become victims of abuse, rape, divorce, rejection, and/or suicide due to the social stigma associated with the practice. In fact, a woman loses her main source of value once she is kidnapped because it is assumed that her virginity has been stripped away. In most cases, this is true because many of the women will be raped the night of her marriage, and even if no sexual intercourse took place, it is still assumed that she is tainted by her removal from the family home. In addition to her kidnapping, most women fail to finish their education because their societal priorities have changed. Their new duties as wife are to be in full servitude to the groom's family. To assure that the women fulfill these roles, it is important that there is limited contact with her family to prevent her escape. But if the bride's family is willing to comply or in support of it, they will use the family as leverage to convince the wife to stay for the sake of the family's reputation. This traps the women in a situation where they must come to terms with how things are or will choose a path that leads to their own demise. This begs the question, why? If there are so many negative impacts on women, how does this practice persist to exist? In fact, how did this so-called ancient tradition come to permanently stay and repeat within the culture? When these very questions were asked to the locals, a very simple answer was provided. It's a tradition. It wasn't just the men that said this, but also the women in the community. In fact, it was even addressed as a man's traditional right to bride kidnap. The locals would reference the Epic of Mana, which is the old epic poem that supposedly contains much of their traditions and customs. But when reviewed by experts for this practice, there is no reference at all to bride kidnapping. After some in-depth research was done, it was found that the tradition is generally a new one with only 40 to 50 years of practice. This time frame was right after the Soviet Union fell and Kyrgyzstan was able to establish its independence. This leaves experts to theorize the different reasons that this tradition integrated itself into the culture. One of the initial theories is that bride kidnapping was a more evolved version of eloping for young couples. It was an easy way to get together without an arranged marriage that was forced by either parental party. In fact, there even was an economic benefit since the financial burden of the kalim, or also known as a dowry, was not present, since it wasn't a traditional wedding. Others believed that it was a practice that would individualize the nation's identity. One of the locals even used the phrase, "It's a positive expression of Kyrgyzstan identity." It was an easy way to enforce their predecessor view of inequality among men and women, and it could be used as a power dynamic that kept men as an authoritative figure in the community. It was an easy tradition for the men to indulge in because the benefits outweighed the costs. For men that were mentally or physically disabled, this practice was in their favor because it increased the chance of finding a woman. Most of these men may have been initially overlooked due to their disability, but now they could be successful in finding a bride. In fact, there is much value placed on a man who is married because he is seen as someone who has exceeded in the community. As for women, there is a question about why this tradition wouldn't fall out of favor because it does not benefit them at all. So how would this practice work its way into Kyrgyzstan society? One theory is that women stayed because of the initial social pressures that were in place before bride kidnapping started. For generations, there had been a social stigma that one should be a virgin until marriage. It was a social norm and standard that women should maintain their good reputation through valuing their virginity. When a bride kidnapping gradually increased within the community, it became difficult to combat the practice since the women were putting theirs and their family's social status at risk. It became a decision of choosing one's freedom or protecting one's reputation, for if she were to leave and be free of her marriage, she would still be under the societal restraints that would prevent her from being acknowledged and accepted by others in the community. She may never find a husband or may be disgraced among the people who are dearest to her. The societal rejection is oftentimes enough to convince the woman to stay and make do with her given situation. This fear is what drives women to stay even when they are miserable doing so. Through generational repetition, both men and women from a young age are embedded with the expectations that a man's success comes from finding a wife, while a woman's success is when complying to her wifely duties and raising a family. With the exponential increase of bride kidnapping over the past several decades, it has become a national crisis that needs to be addressed. Women's human rights were being abused, so the government installed the Article 154 and 155 of the Kyrgyzstani Criminal Code as a direct stance against bride kidnapping. This law states that one can face up to 7 years in prison and 10 years if the women are not of age. Alongside Article 155, another Article 11 of the Criminal Code addresses violence against the woman. A sentence of 3 to 7 years will be determined dependent on the situation. These laws were centered around the mission of Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, to help make aware of the corruption taking place within the country. These organizations hope to bring awareness and educate the idea that these traditions are not above the law, but rather should be under scrutiny for their unjust actions that violate the human rights of these women. Although efforts have been made to cease bride kidnapping, these traditions still infiltrate their way into the government system. Many of the officials are supposed to protect and enforce these laws, but they grew up with these traditional beliefs, thus causing internal conflict between their traditional and official obligations. Their own personal bias may shift how they conduct their work and result in officials turning a blind eye to bride kidnapping and thus allowing it to persist into further generations.